June 25, 1944, near Saint-Lô, Normandy. The hedgerows were alive with the sound of metal and thunder. Rain slicked the muddy roads as the 2nd Panzer Division pulled back through the shattered fields of northern France. For the Germans, it was another day in a war that had turned from conquest to survival. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stood on the side of the road beside his Panther tank, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the haze, he could make out the unmistakable outline of a burning American M4 Sherman. The wreckage still smoldering, its hull split by an armor-piercing round. He lowered the glasses and smirked. "More of these toys," he muttered. "They send them in waves, like cattle to the slaughter." His gunner, a broad-shouldered veteran named Muller, laughed as he loaded another 75mm shell into the breech. "If this is the best the Americans can build, they'll run out of men before we run out of shells." To the crews of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions, the Sherman was a joke, a symbol of industrial arrogance. It was tall, clumsy, under-armored, and armed with a 75mm gun that could barely scratch a Panther's frontal plate. German tankers joked that a Sherman had to get within 50 meters just to make them nervous. But that day, as the Germans regrouped near a crossroads outside Saint-Lô, something strange began to happen. Over the ridge, in the morning mist, came the sound of engines. Not one or two, but dozens. The ground trembled with their weight. Through the hedgerow gaps, Richter saw them emerging. Shermans, one after another, an endless line crawling forward like ants across a battlefield. He counted at least 30 before giving up. 30? Muller muttered. There were only 5 yesterday. They replaced them overnight, Richter said quietly. How is that possible? Moments later, the first shells began to fall. The Americans had learned the rhythm of the battlefield. While German engineers perfected machines of terrifying precision, the Allies had mastered something more potent: speed, numbers, and coordination. Each Sherman that fell was replaced within hours. Each loss was a ripple, not a wound. And for the first time, Klaus Richter felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his pride. Unease. A few miles away, on the American side of the line, Lieutenant James "Jim" Halpern leaned out of the commander's hatch of his Sherman, Lucky Penny. His tank was part of the 2nd Armored Division, fresh off the beaches, still learning how to survive in a world ruled by tigers and panthers. Rain beaded on his helmet as he peered through his binoculars at the distant tree line. "Panthers up ahead," he said into the intercom. 2, maybe 3. His gunner, Private Charles Riley, replied with nervous humor. 2 or 3? What difference does it make? Either way, they'll turn us into soup cans. Halpern smiled grimly. Not if we move first. He knew what the Germans didn't. The Sherman wasn't built to outfight the Panther. It was built to outlast it. "All right, Riley," he said. "Load he. Target that hedge. We'll smoke them out." The turret whirred. The gun barked. The hedgerow erupted in flame and mud. The Panthers opened fire moments later. Their rounds tore through trees and earth, splintering entire trunks. One American tank exploded in a ball of orange fire. Another lurched into a ditch, immobilized. But Lucky Penny kept moving, forward, always forward. That was the American way of war. Each Sherman that burned became a stepping stone for the ones behind it. The Germans called them Tommykotcher, Tommy Cookers, mocking their tendency to ignite when hit. But by late June, the laughter was fading. The Shermans just wouldn't stop coming. When Richter's Panther was finally forced to retreat, its engine overheating, he glanced back across the ridge and saw them again. Rows of Shermans crawling out of the smoke like ghosts, their tracks chewing up the mud where the last wave had died. "How many do they have?" Muller whispered. Richter didn't answer. He knew the truth now. The Americans weren't fighting with superior tanks. They were fighting with an army of factories. Somewhere far beyond this battlefield, while Germany's refineries starved and its trains stalled for lack of fuel, Detroit was building more Shermans. Every hour. Every day. And for every one the Germans destroyed, 5 more were already on the way. The mockery was over. The realization had begun. August 1944, Rouen, France. Night had fallen across the French countryside, the air thick with smoke and the distant rumble of retreating German armor. The once proud 9th Panzer Division was now little more than a shadow. A handful of tanks limping east, engines coughing, tracks loose, and fuel running low. In a bombed-out barn at the edge of town, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter sat with his crew around a flickering lantern. The Panther outside was silent now, its mighty Maybach engine dry. They had enough fuel for maybe 20 kilometers, if they were lucky. Richter stared at the map spread across his knees, but it may as well have been blank. The front line was gone, replaced by chaos. Mueller, his gunner, finally broke the silence. "They're everywhere," he said softly. "The Americans. Every road, every village. Shermans." Richter didn't look up. And everyone looks the same. It was true. The Shermans were a machine army. They came in waves, identical silhouettes rolling out of the dusk, identical engines humming the same note. Identical guns pointed toward the same horizon. Germany, for all its brilliance, could not comprehend it. Back in Berlin, engineers still debated improvements to the Panther's armor slope, the efficiency of its transmission, the optical range of its gun sights. Each adjustment required weeks of retooling, redesign, recalibration. Every German tank was a masterpiece, one that cost as much to build as 5 Shermans. But the Allies didn't need masterpieces. They needed momentum. And momentum was something the Sherman delivered in endless supply. Thousands of kilometers away, in a roaring factory in Detroit, sparks flew like fireworks from a dozen welding stations. The Ford River Rouge plant never slept. Day and night, its conveyor belts groaned with steel plates, gun barrels, and engine blocks. The noise was deafening. Riveters hammering, cranes screeching, furnaces glowing like miniature suns. Foremen with clipboards shouted over the clatter, "Keep it moving! Every 8 minutes! Another tank off the line!" And they meant it. The M4 Sherman was designed for this very rhythm. Its armor was rolled, not cast, making it easy to shape. Its tracks were wide enough for mud, narrow enough for rail transport. Every part was standardized. An engine from one Sherman could fit another without modification. Even its weaponry had been chosen with logistics in mind. The 75mm gun wasn't the most powerful, but it could be mass-produced and serviced anywhere, from a frontline depot to a captured farm barn. On the assembly floor, women in overalls tightened bolts on turret rings, while sparks danced across their goggles. Men guided cranes carrying turret shells the size of small cars into position. The rhythmic clang of hammers and the steady hiss of steam filled the air. A symphony of war production. By midnight, another column of tanks was ready. They rolled out of the factory like an unending parade, their olive-drab hulls glistening under floodlights. On each side, white stars were freshly painted. Simple, functional, unmistakable. A supervisor watched them pass and murmured to a colleague, "You know, those boys over there, they don't have to win every fight. They just have to show up every time." Back in Europe, that prophecy came to life. Normandy's fields, once quiet, were now filled with the rumble of treads. Rows of Shermans moved east under the morning mist, passing by abandoned German positions and burning villages. To the men inside them, each tank felt both personal and replaceable, an odd paradox. They gave their machines names, painted them with dice, pin-up girls, or hometown slogans. But they also knew that if their Sherman fell, another would take its place by sundown. Lieutenant Halpern's lucky penny had survived another week, though it carried scars from every engagement. Shrapnel dents, bullet marks, and a hole patched with scrap steel and paint. He stood outside the tank that morning, coffee in hand, watching a column of replacements arrive on flatbed trucks. The air smelled of diesel and wet grass. Private Riley climbed out of the turret, rubbing oil from his hands. "Sir," he said, nodding toward the convoy. "Looks like the factory's working overtime." Halpern smiled. "That's the point, Riley. They don't run out." From the hedgerows of France to the plains of Poland, the same story repeated itself. The German tank divisions, the proud spearheads of the Blitzkrieg, were being buried under an avalanche of simplicity. A Panther could outshoot a Sherman. A Tiger could outlast one in a duel. But when one Panther broke down, 5 Shermans rolled past it. When a Tiger needed a new gearbox, there were 10 Shermans already surrounding it. For the first time since 1939, the engineers in Germany began to realize they were fighting the wrong kind of war. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about persistence. And the Sherman, crude and ordinary as it seemed, was perfect at persistence. Weeks later, Oberleutnant Richter sat on a captured American jeep, scribbling in his field journal by the dim light of a lantern. Around him, his unit was silent. They had lost their Panther again, this time to a broken drive sprocket, not enemy fire. He had watched another column of Shermans pass that afternoon, 60 of them, at least, marching east like an industrial tide. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, "They are not fighting us with tanks, but with factories. We kill one and 10 return. We destroy a column, and by dusk another appears. Their machines are not superior. They are inevitable." Outside, the wind rattled the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of engines grew louder again. He closed the notebook. The machine that never slept was coming. December 20th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in slow, silent flakes over a landscape torn by chaos. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. German panzers, Panthers, Tigers, and Jagdpanthers pushed west through the dense forest, their engines roaring in the cold. The American lines had been shattered in places, and the roads were choked with retreating trucks and wrecked vehicles. In a small clearing near Bastogne, Lieutenant James Halpern and the crew of Lucky Penny crouched beside their Sherman, breath misting in the freezing air. Their tank's olive-drab paint was streaked with frost and soot, its side pocked with dents from shrapnel and small arms fire. "Panthers ahead," the radio crackled. The voice was tight, nervous. "We've spotted at least 4, maybe 5, moving along the ridge. Keep your heads down." Halpern looked toward the tree line. Through the snow and smoke, he could just make out the hulking shapes. Broad, low silhouettes with thick armor and the long snouts of 75mm high-velocity guns. He knew what that meant. A Sherman against a Panther was never a fair fight. Still, retreat wasn't an option. Bastogne needed to hold. "Load AP," Halpern ordered. The loader slammed the shell into the breach. "Up!" They could hear the German tanks moving now. The crunch of snow, the grinding of gears. "Traverse left," Halpern shouted. "Range 600, fire!" The Sherman bucked as the gun fired. The round struck the Panther's front plate and bounced. The Panther replied instantly. Its shot tore through a nearby American tank, igniting it in an instant. Flames rolled into the sky. The air filled with the sharp smell of burning fuel and melting snow. Inside Lucky Penny, sweat and fear mingled with the stench of cordite. The gunner cursed. "Sir, our rounds can't punch through that front armor." Halpern thought fast. "Then don't shoot the front. Hit the side." He revved the engine and jerked the Sherman into motion, circling through the trees. Snow sprayed from the treads as they weaved between pines. The Panther's turret turned to follow, slow but deliberate. "Faster!" Riley yelled. "I'm trying." They broke into the open just as the Panther fired. The shell screamed past, close enough to rattle the tank's hull. "Now!" Halpern barked. The gun fired again, this time into the Panther's flank. The round punched through, sparks bursting from the exit wound. Smoke gushed from the German turret. "Hit!" shouted the loader. The Panther shuddered, then stopped moving. Another Panther appeared in the trees, But before it could fire, two more Shermans crested the ridge behind Lucky Penny and opened up with everything they had. Tracer rounds sliced through the snowfall. The second Panther exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a roar that lit up the entire valley. "Hell of a sight, huh?" Riley said between breaths. Halpern just nodded, heart still pounding. "She may not hit hard," he said, "but she sure can move." As the snow kept falling, the Sherman's greatest strength revealed itself. Not its gun, not its armor, but its coordination. Each American tank was part of a system. Radios synchronized, tactics drilled, supply lines humming. When one was destroyed, another took its place. When one crew fell, replacements were already on the way. In contrast, the German panzers, mighty as they were trapped by their own excellence. Their transmissions froze in the cold. Their engines guzzled fuel that no longer arrived. Their armor cracked under the strain of constant battle. In the forests of the Ardennes, the perfect machine began to fail against the imperfect one that simply kept going. And for the first time, German commanders started to see what their engineers had never understood. Quantity had a quality all its own. January 1945, east of Bastogne. A German tank workshop stood half-ruined in a captured village. Inside, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter watched as mechanics struggled to repair a battered Panther. The great beast sat on its haunches like a wounded animal. Its right track snapped clean through, its hull peppered with dents. A younger officer entered, his face flushed from the cold. "Herr Oberleutnant," he said, "command reports another Sherman column advancing from the west. At least 40 tanks. Richter didn't react at first. He simply stared at the broken Panther. Its armor was exquisite, angled, smooth, precise. Its gun could kill at 2 kilometers. Its optics were the best in the world. And yet here it was, dead from a broken track and a lack of spare parts. He finally spoke, his voice low. 40 Shermans, he repeated. "And how many Panthers do we have left?" 5 operational, sir. Maybe 6 by dawn." Richter nodded. "That's not a battle. That's a storm." He walked out into the snow, looking toward the west. In the distance, he could hear the dull, rhythmic thunder of approaching engines. He thought back to the beginning of the war, when his division had crossed into France in 1940 with unstoppable speed. Back then, Germany's tanks had been few but unmatched. The world had marveled at their precision, their might, their beauty. Now, in the frozen ruins of Europe, that beauty was useless. The Sherman was ugly, crude, and mechanical, but it was alive. It kept coming. As the Americans pushed the Germans out of the Ardennes, the ground became littered with both sides burned-out hulks. But for every Sherman that lay smoldering, 5 more rolled past it, treads clanking, engines roaring. When the war ended months later, the numbers told the real story. 50,000 Shermans produced. Tens of thousands fighting across 3 continents. Each one part of a machine larger than any single tank. A machine called American industry. For Klaus Richter, captured that spring near the Rhine, the truth had become undeniable. Sitting in a prisoner transport, he stared out the window at a line of Shermans driving east toward Berlin. One of the American guards noticed his expression. "What's the matter, Lieutenant?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Richter shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "not a ghost, just inevitability." April 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Western Germany. The war was over, though few men yet dared to say it aloud. The great factories of the Ruhr, once the heart of Germany's industrial power, now lay silent, their chimneys shattered, their furnaces cold. Smoke drifted from the wreckage of cities, and along the ruined highways, columns of German soldiers marched west. Their weapons slung, their faces hollow with defeat. Among them rode a small convoy of captured officers. In one truck sat Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, his once proud uniform faded and torn. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still stained with the grease of a Panther's engine. Outside, the landscape crawled past, a graveyard of machines. Burned-out half-tracks, twisted gun barrels, and blackened tank husks lined the road. They passed one Panther that had slid into a ditch, its turret blown clean off, its body half buried in mud. A Sherman sat nearby, also destroyed. But it had been pushed aside to clear the road, replaced already by another from the endless supply line stretching west to east. The American escort vehicles hummed steadily. Jeeps, trucks, and the occasional M4 tank rolling alongside, their tracks clattering over the cobblestones. The white star on their hulls was everywhere, painted hastily yet unmistakable. A mark not of precision, but of persistence. Richter's driver muttered something under his breath, staring at the passing Shermans. "They built so many," he said softly. "It's unnatural." Richter didn't answer. He was thinking of the words an old instructor had once told him at the Panzer School in 1938. "A tank must be perfect before it goes to war." He almost laughed now. The Shermans had never been perfect, but they had won. That same morning, a column of American armor rolled east along the Autobahn. The tanks gleamed under a pale sun, their surfaces caked with dust and streaked with dried mud. On the lead Sherman, Lucky Penny, Lieutenant James Halpern stood upright in the open turret, scanning the road ahead through his binoculars. The radio buzzed with static. "Enemy surrender confirmed in the next village, sir. No resistance." Halpern nodded, lowering the binoculars. "All right, keep moving. Let's finish this." He leaned back into the turret. "You know, Riley," he said to his gunner, "I don't think I've got another campaign in me." Riley chuckled. "You and me both, sir. I figure this girl's earned her retirement, too." They both looked around at their tank. The gouges along the side, the patched armor plates, the worn barrel. She'd survived North Africa, Normandy, the Bulge. Now she was rolling into the heart of Germany itself. A few years earlier, the very idea would have been unthinkable. Back then, the Wehrmacht had seemed invincible. Now, the roads that once carried Panzers to Paris carried Shermans to Berlin. Every rivet, every scratch, every dent on Lucky Penny told a story, not of glory, but of endurance. A few days later, as American forces consolidated their positions in the Ruhr, a small group of captured German officers, including Richter, was brought to an open field to witness something that, months earlier, would have been unimaginable. Rows upon rows of Shermans stretched across the horizon, hundreds of them, lined up in perfect columns, engines idling, their exhausts puffing white smoke into the morning air. It was not a parade, it was logistics incarnate. Every tank was nearly identical. Same gun, same tracks, same markings. And yet, each one carried a crew that had lived through 1,000 small miracles. Bridges repaired, engines patched, radios rewired, guns rebored. It was a machine that repaired itself through sheer human will. The German officers stood in silence. One of them, a tall, gray-haired colonel from Munich, shook his head in disbelief. 50,000, he murmured. 50,000 of these. My God. Richter spoke quietly, almost to himself. They understood something we never did. The colonel turned. "What's that?" Richter's eyes didn't leave the endless line of tanks. "That a tank isn't a weapon. It's an idea." The colonel frowned. "An idea?" "Yes," Richter said. "Ours was perfection. Theirs was persistence. And persistence wins." Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Halpern's company halted outside a captured town. Children peeked from behind the ruins, watching as the American crews dismounted, laughing and stretching their legs. A few soldiers handed out chocolate and cigarettes to the villagers. Others cleaned their tank guns or checked the tracks for wear. Riley stood on top of Lucky Penny, wiping soot from the barrel. "You think this is it, sir?" he called down. Halpern smiled tiredly. "I think the war's over, Riley." He climbed down from the turret, running his hand along the Sherman's side. The metal was warm under the sun, pitted with scars and blackened around the hatches. He remembered all the times he'd cursed this tank, its narrow turret, its underpowered gun, its tendency to catch fire when hit. He'd hated it once. But now, it was something else. It was home. In Berlin, months later, Allied intelligence compiled reports comparing the armor production of both sides. The figures were staggering. Germany, 347 Tiger tanks built. America, over 49,000 Shermans. The math spoke for itself. Every Tiger was a masterpiece. Engineered with obsessive precision, assembled by hand, capable of killing a Sherman at 2 kilometers. But each one required weeks of labor, special tools, and skilled craftsmen who were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Sherman, by contrast, could be built in less than a week, repaired in a field, and shipped across an ocean by the hundreds. Its weakness was its weapon. Its strength was everything else. Reliability, mobility, simplicity, unity. And when multiplied 50,000 times, those virtues became something more powerful than steel. They became inevitability. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, captured Wehrmacht engineers were quietly transported to Allied research centers. Among them was Klaus Richter. He was assigned to a facility near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, assisting U.S. officers in cataloging captured German equipment. The Americans treated him well. Better, in fact, than he expected. One afternoon, a young U.S. Army engineer approached him with a clipboard. "Herr Richter," he said, "we've been analyzing your Panther. Incredible machine, but complicated." Richter smiled faintly. "Yes, that was always our problem. We built a masterpiece in a world that needed a tool." The American nodded thoughtfully. "And the Sherman?" Richter paused, looking out the window toward the distant Alps, their snow-capped peaks glowing in the afternoon sun. "The Sherman was never meant to impress engineers," he said. "It was meant to win wars." He turned back, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. And it did. May 1946. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The war was over, but the machines that had fought it were still being studied. In long hangars filled with rows of captured vehicles, Tigers, Panthers, and Shermans alike, engineers, soldiers, and historians examined the remnants of the most mechanized conflict in history. A single Sherman stood at the center of the testing yard, its olive drab faded, its armor pitted by shrapnel scars. Nearby, a Tiger WWII towered over it, a hulking beast of German engineering. To the untrained eye, the contrast was obvious. One elegant and menacing, the other plain, almost crude. But to those who had lived through the war, the real difference ran deeper. Colonel James Halpern, older now, his uniform pressed but his eyes tired, walked slowly around the Tiger, tracing a hand along its thick armor. The steel was cold and smooth, over 100 millimeters thick. The gun barrel was enormous, a piece of machinery designed to dominate any battlefield. Beside him stood an American ordnance officer, clipboard in hand. "You can admire it, sir," the officer said. "But you wouldn't want to maintain it." Halpern nodded. "No, I wouldn't. Beautiful machine, though. Terrifying, too." The officer flipped a page on his notes. "It took over 300,000 man-hours to build one of these. Compare that to about 30,000 for a Sherman." Halpern chuckled softly. 10 to 1. That sounds about right. He looked over at the Sherman sitting nearby, its smaller guns still tilted skyward, as if defiant even now. "She wasn't glamorous," he said quietly, "but she got us home." A week later, in a lecture hall filled with military cadets, Halpern stood before a blackboard covered with chalk diagrams, tank silhouettes, production graphs, and casualty statistics. Behind him, the smell of cigarette smoke and old paper filled the air. He gestured toward a chart showing 2 simple bars, one tall and slender, labeled M4 Sherman. The other short but wide, labeled Tiger I. "This," he began, tapping the taller bar, "won the war. Not because it was stronger, not because it was faster, but because it existed in numbers that no army could ever hope to match. The cadets scribbled notes furiously. "You see, gentlemen," Halpern continued, "Germany built the best tanks in the world. But they built them like they were building watches. Precision parts, perfect tolerances, and production so slow it couldn't keep up with the battlefield. The Sherman, on the other hand, was built like a hammer. Crude, maybe, but you could drop it in the mud, pull it out, and it would still work." He paused, looking out over the young faces watching him. Wars aren't won by perfection. They're won by what's good enough, multiplied by 100,000. Across the Atlantic in Stuttgart, Klaus Richter sat in a small workshop, surrounded by drawings of machines that would never be built. The war had ended his career as an engineer, but not his fascination with design. On his desk sat a small photograph, taken by an American photographer in 1945, showing a column of Shermans rolling across the Rhine, sunlight glinting off their steel. He studied it often, as if searching for the secret that had eluded him during the war. A knock came at the door. A young German student entered, hat in hand. "Herr Richter," he said politely, "I've been reading your notes on the Panthers' suspension. May I ask what you think of the American Sherman?" Richter smiled faintly. "I used to think it was primitive," he said. "Now I think it was genius." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph. "You see, young man, we believed victory came from excellence. But the Americans, they believed it came from endurance. They built a tank that could lose today and come back tomorrow. That's something no engineer can calculate." The student nodded slowly, unsure what to say. Richter continued, his tone soft but resolute. "In war, the perfect machine dies with its operator. The imperfect one outlives them both." In the years that followed, the Sherman's legacy only grew. It became the foundation of post-war armor design, exported, upgraded, and rebuilt by dozens of nations. In Korea, Israel, and even the Middle East, she fought on long after newer machines had come and gone. At memorials across Europe, veterans stood beside surviving Shermans on display, weathered, rusted, and silent, yet still imposing in their simplicity. Some men wept as they touched the steel hulls that had once carried them through hell. Others simply stood in silence, lost in memory. At a ceremony in Normandy, Halpern, older, slower, walking with a cane, approached one such tank, its olive paint faded to gray. A small plaque read, "M4A3 Sherman, 3rd Armored Division, Lucky Penny, landed at Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. Survived 127 days of combat." He placed a hand on the hull. The metal was cold but solid, still bearing the faint scars of battle. "Thank you," he whispered. A breeze rustled through the grass. Somewhere nearby, a child asked his father why this tank looked so old, so simple. The man smiled and said, "Because it didn't need to be anything else." Back in the United States, at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, an exhibit opened in 1952. At its center stood a fully restored Sherman, polished and pristine. Beside it, a sign bore a quote from an anonymous German engineer captured in 1945. Words believed to have been spoken by Klaus Richter himself. "We design machines to last forever. They design machines to arrive tomorrow." The visitors who read those words often paused, thinking not of technology, but of what those machines represented. The spirit that built them, the hands that drove them, and the will that refused to yield. Because the Sherman was never just steel and bolts. It was a declaration, a promise made in metal that even when outmatched, outgunned, and outdesigned, human perseverance would still find a way. The Tiger was remembered for its fear, the Panther for its precision. But the Sherman was remembered for coming home.